In this story, we see how a seemingly innocent attempt at intimidation can quickly spiral into a much more powerful exchange of psychological warfare. It's a reminder that in the world of power dynamics, sometimes the roles we expect to play are not as solid as we think. When a prison guard tries to assert control over a young inmate, she has no idea that what she expects to be a simple show of dominance will instead end with her questioning her own sense of authority. What happened next left her not only shaken, but utterly rethinking her place in the prison system. Sarah walked briskly through the long, dimly lit corridor of the prison, her boots thudding rhythmically against the cold concrete floor. The sound echoed in the empty space, marking her presence as if it were a stamp of authority. As a senior prison guard, Sarah had grown accustomed to this life, one of control, discipline, and the constant assertion of power. She wore her uniform like armor, the dark blue fabric tight against her well-toned frame. Her short, sharp-cropped hair framed a face that rarely betrayed emotion, and her eyes were always sharp, scanning the surroundings for potential threats. Today, her focus was on a new inmate. Ethan, a young man barely out of his teens, had just been transferred to her block. He had a reputation, though not one that had been earned through actions that would endear him to anyone. Sarah didn't know much about him yet, but she had already formed a clear impression. The boy was trouble. He carried himself with an air of defiance, one that she knew would need to be broken before he got too comfortable in her domain. When she first saw him, he was standing by his cell, eyes locked on the far wall, seemingly lost in his thoughts. The uniformed guards who had escorted him here had been stern, but the boy had barely acknowledged them, his posture straight and unwavering. Ethan was lean, his frame athletic but not bulky. His clothes hung loosely on him, the typical prison garb designed to conceal as much as it revealed. His scruffy hair fell over his forehead, and his face, still youthful but worn by the harshness of his surroundings, betrayed a sense of weariness. But there was something in his eyes that caught Sarah's attention. Something raw. Something that told her he wasn't easily intimidated. He was different from the usual prisoners. The others, they cowered under her gaze, shrinking beneath her authority. But not him. Sarah was used to seeing fear in their eyes. Fear was power, she believed, but this young man seemed to have none of it. Instead, he looked at her with a certain level of indifference, as if her presence didn't mean anything to him at all. The moment she laid eyes on him, she knew she'd have to deal with him soon, and she wasn't one to back down from a challenge. She stopped in front of his cell, her stance firm and commanding. Her eyes didn't waver as she waited for him to acknowledge her. His gaze remained fixed on the wall for a few moments, as if he hadn't even noticed her standing there. Finally, he turned to face her, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah was taken aback by the emptiness in his stare. His eyes were hard, unblinking, and unmoving, a stark contrast to the usual mixture of fear and submission she had grown used to from most inmates. His face showed little emotion, but there was a subtle tension in his jaw that suggested he was sizing her up, not intimidated but calculating. "You're Ethan, right?" she asked, her voice steady, with a hint of challenge hidden beneath her calm tone. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took his time, his eyes still locked onto hers, before finally speaking. "Yeah," he said simply, his voice low and unbothered. Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You know the rules here. You will follow them, or you'll regret it." Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just stared at her, almost as if he were waiting for her to continue. It was unsettling. Most inmates would have dropped their gaze by now, perhaps stuttering an apology or offering some half-hearted excuse. But Ethan didn't give her that satisfaction. His indifference felt almost like an affront to her authority. "You don't seem very scared," she remarked, trying to provoke some response, but his calmness only seemed to irritate her further. He raised an eyebrow at her, as though the question was beneath him. "I'm not scared of you." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Sarah could feel the tension build between them. It wasn't like the usual resistance she encountered. This wasn't a simple act of defiance that would break once she showed her authority. No, this was something different, something that made her wonder if she had underestimated this young man from the very beginning. She took a step closer to the bars of his cell, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You should be. I don't take kindly to disrespect." Her voice had taken on a sharper edge, a tone meant to make him aware of her position. But instead of backing down, Ethan merely glanced at the ground, as though he were bored by the whole exchange. When she stepped back and turned to leave, she could feel his gaze on her, following her every movement. The feeling unsettled her in a way she hadn't expected. She had expected him to bend under the weight of her authority, but there was no bending. There was only an uncomfortable calm. Ethan leaned against the cold steel bars of his cell, watching the guard's retreating figure. Sarah had tried to assert control over him, but her words had been hollow, ineffective. He'd been through too much, seen too many guards come and go, to be intimidated by someone like her. There was a certain quiet confidence about him, a calmness that came from years of being thrown into difficult situations and finding a way to navigate through them. Prison had made him sharper, harder, and he wasn't about to let some guard with a badge and a uniform push him around. His thin yet muscular frame gave off an air of quiet strength. Though he didn't speak much, his presence alone seemed to command attention. He wasn't as tall as some of the other inmates, but his posture, his stillness, made him appear taller than he actually was. His dark, tousled hair hung over his brow, and his eyes, though tired, held a glint of intelligence and defiance. Ethan didn't feel fear. Not anymore. He'd seen too much, done too much, to be afraid of what anyone might try to do to him in this place. When he'd first heard Sarah's voice, he'd turned to face her with the same nonchalance he had toward everything else in this prison. He wasn't going to pretend to be scared of her. It wasn't that he didn't recognize the power she held, it was that he didn't care about it. To him, she was just another cog in the wheel of a broken system. Her attempts at asserting dominance, her words of warning, meant nothing to him. Ethan had learned long ago that survival wasn't about following the rules. It was about breaking them when it suited you, playing the game in a way that others didn't expect. As Sarah left, he could feel her eyes still on him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a slight twinge of something unfamiliar. Curiosity. He wasn't sure what it was, but it made him uneasy. It wasn't often he left an impression on someone like that. Most people either feared him or ignored him, but Sarah had been different. She hadn't flinched, but he had sensed something in her, something that hinted at cracks in her armor. It was a dangerous game they were both playing, and neither of them was going to back down easily. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan had somehow slipped under her radar. The usual tactics she used to break down inmates and assert her authority had been ineffective with him. His defiance didn't seem like an act of rebellion. It was more like a challenge. He wasn't just refusing to cower, he was quietly calling her bluff. In all her years working in the prison, she'd encountered all types of prisoners, those who feared her, those who tried to manipulate her, and those who wanted to test her. But Ethan was different. He had something about him that unsettled her, a quiet confidence that was unshakable. A few days passed before Sarah found another opportunity to confront him, this time under the guise of a routine check-in. She made her way to his cell, deliberately taking a longer route, knowing that he would be watching. She could feel his eyes on her even before she rounded the corner. It was unsettling how much attention he paid to her, but she had to admit, it was also intriguing. It was like he was dissecting her every move, studying her with a focus that sent a chill down her spine. When she reached his cell, she noticed that Ethan was standing by the bars again, as if he'd been waiting for her. He leaned casually against them, his posture relaxed, but there was something in the way his eyes locked onto hers that gave her pause. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even respect. It was an odd combination of curiosity and calculation, as if he were trying to figure her out just as much as she was trying to figure him out. "Ethan," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady, though she could feel a slight tremor creeping into her tone. "I've been hearing things about you. Some of the other guards are concerned. They say you're trouble." Ethan didn't respond immediately, but his lips quirked into the faintest smile, a smile that held no warmth. "Trouble, huh?" His voice was soft but full of sarcasm, and Sarah felt a flicker of frustration. He wasn't playing by the rules. He wasn't giving her what she wanted, and that made him dangerous. "You've been avoiding your work assignments," she pressed, leaning in slightly, trying to intimidate him. "That's going to stop. If you want to survive here, you're going to have to follow the rules." There was a moment of silence before Ethan spoke again, his tone calm but carrying an undercurrent of something deeper. "I'm not interested in surviving here." He took a slow, deliberate step toward the bars, his face inches from hers. His eyes didn't waver as he spoke. "I'm interested in making it through. There's a difference." His words hit harder than she expected. Most inmates would beg for survival. They would do whatever it took to avoid conflict, to keep their heads down. But Ethan wasn't like most inmates. He wasn't trying to hide or escape. He was simply existing, defying the system in his own quiet way. Sarah was taken aback by his response, but she quickly masked it with a cold, authoritative expression. "Don't get too comfortable," she said, trying to reassert herself. "You don't have a choice here. You'll play by my rules or you'll regret it." Ethan's gaze didn't falter, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. He leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice just enough for her to hear. "I don't think you understand," he said, his words almost a whisper. "You think this place is your domain, but you're just a pawn in a much bigger game. A game that neither of us controls." Sarah's stomach tightened as she absorbed his words. She had expected him to be defiant, to argue, to shout even, but he hadn't raised his voice. He had spoken with an unsettling calmness that only made his message more jarring. For a moment, she felt an odd sense of vulnerability, as if the ground beneath her had shifted just slightly, enough for her to question whether she truly understood her own power. She straightened, fighting the unsettling feeling his words had sparked. "You don't know who you're talking to," she said, forcing the words out, even though a small part of her was starting to doubt herself. Ethan smiled again, this time with more certainty. "No. I know exactly who I'm talking to. The question is, do you know who you're dealing with?" Sarah took a step back, her mind racing. She had been trained to deal with insubordination, to crush any hint of rebellion before it could spread. But Ethan wasn't reacting the way the others did. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't angry. He was calm. And that calmness was eating at her, chipping away at her sense of control. She had never been in a situation like this, where the tables were not only turned, but subtly twisted in a way she couldn't predict. She needed to regain the upper hand. She had to assert her authority, make it clear that she was still in control. But the problem was, every time she tried to do so, Ethan's gaze kept pulling her back, making her question whether she was still the one in charge. "I don't need to explain myself to you," she said, trying to gather her composure. "Just know that if you step out of line again, I won't hesitate to make things harder for you." Ethan didn't flinch, his eyes steady on hers. "You won't make anything harder for me, because you don't control anything here." He paused, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of something in his eyes, an understanding. "You think you're in charge, but you're not. You're just another part of this system like everyone else. You're only as powerful as they let you be." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It was as if Ethan could see right through her, see the cracks in the armor she had so carefully constructed over the years. He wasn't just challenging her authority. He was making her question her entire role in the prison, and that realization was far more dangerous than any threat or act of defiance he could ever show her. As she turned and walked away, Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of his words pressing on her chest. She had underestimated him, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure if she was still in control of the situation. She had always believed that power came from the uniform, from the badge, from the rules. But Ethan had made her see that power, real power, was something far more elusive and far more dangerous. Sarah couldn't sleep that night. The oppressive weight of Ethan's words kept replaying in her mind, echoing through the silence of her quarters. She tried to focus on the tasks at hand, going over security procedures, checking the routine reports, but nothing seemed to hold her attention the way his quiet defiance did. It wasn't just the way he had spoken, so calm, so collected. It was the content of his words that disturbed her. She had always seen herself as the dominant force in the prison, the one who controlled the environment, who could bend even the most unruly inmate to her will. But Ethan had made her feel something she hadn't in years. Doubt. It was unusual for someone like Sarah to feel vulnerable. Her entire career had been built on the foundation of power and control. She knew how to read people, how to break them down, and how to force them into submission. That's what she was trained for. And yet, with Ethan, none of that worked. The usual tactics she employed to instill fear, to remind the inmates who held the power, had no effect on him. It was as if he was playing a different game, one that she couldn't quite understand, and that made him dangerous. The next morning, Sarah entered the prison once more, determined to regain the upper hand. She couldn't let Ethan think he had some sort of psychological advantage over her. She had to remind him who was in charge. But as she walked through the corridors, her mind kept drifting back to the moments they had shared during their last exchange. His words had been piercing, and though she wanted to believe they were meaningless, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that he had been right. He had seen through her. As Sarah approached his cell, she saw that Ethan was sitting on his bunk, his head resting against the wall. He didn't seem to be doing anything in particular, just staring at the floor with an expression of disinterest. When he noticed her approaching, he didn't move. He simply looked up, his gaze unfazed, but this time there was something different in it. There was no defiance in his eyes, no challenge. Instead, there was something much colder, like he had already made his peace with the situation, whatever it might be. That sense of calm he exuded had an unsettling quality to it, like a storm that hadn't yet hit, but would bring destruction when it did. Sarah stopped in front of his cell. This time she wouldn't give him the chance to control the conversation. This time she would take the lead. "Ethan," she said, her voice firm and steady. "You think you can undermine me? Think you're untouchable? You're not." She crossed her arms, looking directly at him. "You can try to ignore the rules all you want, but sooner or later you'll realize that this place will break you. Everyone breaks. Ethan didn't respond right away, instead continuing to watch her with that same unwavering gaze. It was almost as if he was studying her, trying to understand her motivations, trying to decipher her next move. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but laced with an undeniable edge. "Maybe you're right," he said, slowly, as if weighing his words. "Maybe this place will break me. Maybe it'll break all of us. But you know what? The more you try to control me, the more I realize how much control you really have over your own life." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. His words struck a nerve, and for a moment she faltered, unsure of how to respond. Ethan's calmness, his ability to remain so centered in the face of her authority, was more powerful than any outburst or act of resistance. It was a reminder of something Sarah had long buried deep within herself. The idea that perhaps she, too, was a product of the same system that imprisoned these men. She had once been full of ambition, driven by a need to prove herself, but somewhere along the way, the lines had blurred. She had become part of the machinery, just like the prisoners she now oversaw. "Don't talk to me about control," she snapped, her voice tinged with irritation. "You don't get to lecture me. You're in my world now. You don't make the rules here, I do." But even as she said the words, she felt a flicker of doubt deep within her. She wasn't just trying to convince him, she was trying to convince herself. Ethan leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Then why do you care so much about keeping me in line? If you really have control, why do you feel threatened by me?" The question hit her harder than she expected. She could feel her heartbeat quicken as her stomach twisted. She knew she should have brushed off his words, should have dismissed them as mere defiance from a young, cocky inmate. But she couldn't. They cut through her like a knife, opening up something raw and uncomfortable. "I don't feel threatened by you," Sarah said quickly, more to convince herself than him. "I just don't like being undermined." "But you are," Ethan said almost as if it were a simple fact. "You think you have power here, but power doesn't come from the uniform or the badge or the walls. It comes from knowing who you really are and not letting anyone make you doubt it, not even yourself." His words left her speechless. She had always prided herself on her confidence, her ability to handle difficult situations with authority. But now, Ethan had forced her to confront something she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. That perhaps the power she had was not as solid as she had believed. The idea that someone like him, someone who had nothing left to lose, could make her question her own convictions was a terrifying thought. Before Sarah could respond, Ethan stood up slowly, walking to the bars of his cell with a quiet grace. He stood right in front of her, looking down at her with a calm that was almost unnerving. "You can keep telling yourself you're in charge," he said softly, "but deep down you know you're just like me. You're trapped here too." The words hit her like a cold wave. She had always believed that she was in control of her life, her career. But now, standing in front of Ethan, she was beginning to see the cracks in her armor. She had spent years building up walls around herself, convincing herself that the authority she wielded was real. But what if it was all an illusion? What if, like Ethan, she was just playing a role in a system that controlled her as much as it controlled the prisoners? The realization was unsettling. The guard, who had always prided herself on being untouchable, unshakable, was starting to feel like nothing more than a pawn in a much bigger game. The feeling of vulnerability crept in, and it made her heart race in a way that was both uncomfortable and liberating. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah wasn't sure if she had the answers. and that uncertainty was the last thing she had ever expected to find herself feeling. Sarah walked out of the cell block with a measured pace, but inside her mind was racing. The heavy steel doors closed behind her with a loud clang, the sound reverberating down the long, dimly lit corridor. Normally she found the noise comforting. It was the sound of control, the sound of boundaries being reinforced. But now, it felt different. It felt final, like she was locking herself in rather than locking someone else out. She headed toward her office, trying to push the conversation with Ethan out of her head. He had gotten under her skin. There was no denying it. That realization unsettled her more than anything. She had dealt with manipulative inmates before, criminals who thought they could outsmart her, charm their way into favors, or provoke her into losing her temper. But Ethan wasn't like them. He wasn't looking for a way out, wasn't playing an obvious game. He was playing a deeper one, and she wasn't sure if she had just won or lost. Her office was a stark, impersonal space. A metal desk, a few filing cabinets, a single fluorescent light casting a cold glow over the room. It was a place built for efficiency, not comfort. Sitting down in her chair, she took a deep breath and tried to focus on her work. Reports, disciplinary logs, scheduling, things she could control, things that followed predictable rules. And yet, the words on the papers in front of her blurred together, her concentration slipping through her fingers like sand. Ethan's voice still lingered in her mind. "You're trapped here too." Why did that bother her so much? She had chosen this career. She had worked hard to earn her place, to rise through the ranks. She had power here. She wasn't a prisoner, was she? The thought made her shift uncomfortably in her seat. She had never considered the possibility that she was as much a part of the system as the inmates were, but when she really thought about it, how much freedom did she actually have? She spent more time in this prison than she did anywhere else. The rigid routines, the unchanging structure, the need to constantly assert authority, it all dictated her every move. Even when she wasn't here, she carried the weight of it with her. It shaped how she thought, how she acted. She stood up abruptly, as if movement would somehow shake off the feeling creeping up on her. Walking over to the small, barred window in her office, she stared outside at the cold, grey yard where prisoners milled about under the watchful eyes of the other guards. Ethan was out there now, sitting on a bench, arms crossed as he stared at nothing in particular. From here, he looked so small, just another inmate in an orange jumpsuit. And yet he had made her feel something she hadn't in years. Uncertainty, doubt. Anger flickered in her chest. She had spent her entire career proving herself, proving that she belonged in this male-dominated environment, proving that she wasn't weak, proving that she could handle anything thrown at her. She wasn't about to let some young inmate unravel everything she had built. She turned away from the window, pacing the room. Maybe she had been too lenient with him. Maybe she needed to reassert her control, remind him who held the power here. She could make his life miserable. Solitary confinement, revoked privileges, extra work detail. There were a dozen ways to make him regret challenging her. And yet something in her hesitated. She had always believed that power came from control, but for the first time she wondered if true power was something else entirely. Ethan wasn't in control of his circumstances. He was locked up, completely at the mercy of the system, but somehow he had more control over himself than she did. He didn't react the way she expected. He didn't lash out, didn't beg, didn't break under pressure. He simply existed, unshaken. Could she say the same for herself? The thought unsettled her. She had spent so long building up walls around herself, crafting an image of strength, of authority. But what if that wasn't real strength? What if true strength was knowing who you were, regardless of the circumstances? Sarah sat back down, rubbing her temples. She had always prided herself on being unshakable. But for the first time in years, she felt something cracking beneath the surface. She didn't know what to do with that feeling, and that terrified her more than anything.